Hi, welcome to all of you at this event organized by the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, the Lorentz Center in cooperation with SPUI25. The theme of this event is Beyond the Crisis in Psychology. Why this theme? Well, actually, that is because of the fact that Iris van Rooij, Professor Iris van Rooij, is this year's recipient of the Distinguished Lorentz Fellowship. And to celebrate this fellowship, what do we do as scholars? Well, then we reflect and we want to discuss things. And so to celebrate the very fact that Iris received this fellowship, we will discuss a theme that is very close to her heart and to her mind, the crisis of replication in psychology. More about that in a minute. My name is Willem Duivendak. I'm director of NIAS, and let me briefly tell you about today's program. After this program, we start with a brief introduction by Louise Gunning on the NIAS-Lorentz cooperation. Then, obviously, that is followed by the talk by Iris van Rooij herself. And then there will be two discussants, Kenneth J Gurjan and Sarah Georgeston. We'll both briefly discuss the lecture by Iris van Rooij. Iris will then briefly respond, and then we open up the floor to you. So all of you, wherever you are, you can participate and you can raise your questions. There are actually three ways to raise your questions. First, you can Twitter your questions. So there is a hashtag NIAS-KNAW, and if you're on the hashtag, we will see your questions and I can raise them here. Second, there is a chat function in the Zoom, as you know, and you can raise there your question yourself. And third, those who are following this on YouTube, you can also raise your questions using the chat function there. And those questions also will be input for our discussion here with all panelists. But before we go to the lecture and the discussants, I want to give the floor first to Louise Gunning, who will introduce the Lorentz NIAS cooperation. Let me briefly introduce Louise. Louise Gunning is University Professor of Health and Society at the University of Amsterdam. And she is, and therefore that's what she's going to do, she's also the chair of the NIAS-Lorentz Advisory Board. And speaking on behalf of this board, Louise Gunning will shortly introduce on the collaboration between NIAS and Lorentz, and she will shed light on the relevance of interdisciplinary approaches within research projects. Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan Willem, and welcome to all of you. Of course, we would have preferred to see you all in person, but I'm very, very happy that SPUI25 offers us a platform in which we can meet virtually to discuss. Before I introduce the Distinguished Lorentz Fellowship, I'd like to just look at the collaboration between NIAS and the Lorentz Center. NIAS, by definition, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies that has traditionally had a focus on the humanities, and the Lorentz Center that has brought together the tradition of the sciences of having week-long workshops in which eminent scholars meet and discuss and really work at making progress in their field. Now, half a century ago, or maybe even more, C.P. Snow introduced the idea of the two cultures. We refuse to acknowledge that. The schism between sciences and humanities in our concept of the future may exist, but we're not going to accept it. Instead, we think that eminent scientists should be able to bridge that schism. And NIAS and Lorentz have chosen to do so. They have put in place the possibility of organizing a workshop at the Lorentz Center which is interdisciplinary and is selected both by the NIAS and the Lorentz Center together. And the most prominent award that they have is Distinguished Lorentz Fellowship, somebody who is able to bridge different disciplines and gets an opportunity to stay at NIAS and from there on also organize a Lorentz workshop. The Distinguished Lorentz Fellow offers an excellent researcher a chance to explore the boundaries of their own discipline, to bring together scientific traditions from different fields to address vital scientific issues. And in our selection this year, Iris obviously proposes to do so. So I'm delighted that today we see the start of that Distinguished Lorentz Fellowship in the fellow of Iris van Rooij. And I'd like to give the floor back to Jan Willem Duivendak to introduce her.
Thanks so much, Louise. Let me indeed briefly introduce Iris van Rooij, the Distinguished Lorentz Fellow of 2020-2021, who already started to spend her year at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies. Iris van Rooij is specialized in cognitive science and psychology. Van Rooij is professor of computational cognitive science at the Lorentz Center for Cognition. Her research projects at NIAS, Tools for Theory, Improving the Theoretical Foundations of Psychological Science, focuses upon the question, how can we build better theories? Van Rooij is one of the pioneers in the development of tools for theory development in psychological science. She argues that it's not effects, but explanations that need to be discovered in psychology. Well, let me stop there because she can far better explain what is at stake herself. So I love to give the floor to Iris van Rooij for her lecture as a Distinguished Lorentz Fellow. Iris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan Willem. And also thank you very much, Louise. So let me share my screen. Okay. So before I start, I would like to thank both the NIAS and the Lorentz Center for their generous support for this project and honoring me with the DLF Fellowship and Prize. It is truly humbling. At the same time, we all know that few scientific achievements are individual achievements, and the same holds for me. I'm grateful for the many interdisciplinary collaborations with friends and colleagues in computer science, philosophy, linguistics, cognitive science, AI, and statistics, and also in psychology that have shaped my thoughts and have brought me where I am today. Now, the list is too long to mention everyone. It would fill half my talk, but I would like to give special mention to the collaborators with whom I have been actively working on concrete aspects of this DLF project, both now and during its conception. And these are Mark Blokpoel, Patricia Rich, Ronald de Haan, Todd Warham, and Josue Baggio. Okay. So let me start by telling you a story. It's a story about the picture that you are seeing in the background. It's a story that motivated my DLF project. Now, this story is necessarily abstract because it is part of meta-science, that is, the study of how science is done. For more than 100 years, ever since psychology was born as a science in the 19th century, psychologists have believed that the experimental method makes psychology a science as opposed to mere philosophy. By using experiments and later also statistics, psychologists tried to establish effects that they could produce and reproduce in the lab. These effects would then serve as solid bricks for building a solid science of mind and behavior. but the last decade, cracks have been appearing in the discipline's walls. Many of the famous effects that psychologists claim to have observed in their labs and have published in high-standing journals turn out not replicable. This means that when different researchers try to repeat the experiments, they often, more often than expected, fail to reproduce the published effects in their labs. In other words, these published effects are likely not real. Instead, they could be statistical errors, or worse, the result of questionable research practices. Now, this problem is so common that psychologists are talking of a replication crisis, or a crisis of confidence. As with any problem, how you set out to solve it depends on how you diagnose its causes. Psychologists have been so married to the idea that science is built on effects that they keep seeking solutions in making experiments and the use of statistics better. This way, they try to make the bricks more solid and robust. But if we stand back for a moment and look at the cracks in the wall, we can see that the problem is not with the bricks per se. The problem is in the foundation on which the wall is built. That is what is causing the cracks. Now, in my DLF project, I aim to address the problem at its root cause. Psychology is built on weak theoretical foundations, possibly by an eagerness to distance oneself from philosophy and by a lack of training in formal theoretical tools and methods. It is hence no surprise that cracks appear, and the problem cannot be solved with more and better bricks. Now, despite the fact that the replication crisis has affected several areas of psychology, there are also areas of psychology, such as cognitive psychology, that seem less affected. They do have solid bricks and replicable effects. Maybe having a look at cognitive psychology and some of these bricks, we can learn important lessons. So let's have a look. So here I just show you a small selection of well-known effects, and let's start with the famous Stroop effect. If I ask you to name the color of these letter strings, then you will probably experience that this is easier to do for the X's than for the color words. If you try to do it as fast as possible, you are also likely to make errors for the color words, but not when naming the color of the X's. And this is because you're experiencing interference, because the color words are incongruent with the ink in which they are written. So this is known as the Stroop effect. Now, another example of an effect is actually a member of a whole class of effects known as perceptual illusions. And what I show you here is known as the Knizia triangle. Probably what you see there is a white triangle. And maybe even you see that the white of this triangle overlaying another triangle is slightly more white than the background. But in fact, there is no triangle. And the fact that you think there's a triangle or you perceive it, that is a visual illusion. Another well-known effect is the McGurk effect. If I were to show you a video of a mouth that makes the movement, the lips move, as one would move one's lip when one says ga. And over the speakers, I present the sound ba, then what you will hear is the sound da. This multimodal integration effect is what is known as the McGurk effect. Now, one last example is from memory research. You can easily try this at home if you want. If I were to read to you a list of words, say 14 words, and I would ask you afterwards, after having listened to this list, to write down all the words that you can recall, then you will observe that you are more likely to recall words at the beginning of the list and words at the end of the list. And this effect is known as the primacy and the recency effect, respectively. Okay, so these are just a handful of examples of effects in cognitive psychology, and there are many more. In fact, if you go online, you can actually partake in all kinds of demos of well-known effects. So maybe you think, well, that's great. So this is what psychological science is about. And I must admit, I also thought so at first myself. Effects like these are cool and interesting, and honestly, they were what attracted me to study psychology in the first place. But on closer examination, they turn out to be secondary, because ultimately, as scientists, we are only interested in these effects insofar as they help us understand the workings of real-world cognitive capacities, such as cognitive control, vision, communication, and memory. But for knowing how these effects actually help us to understand these capacities, we need theories of these capacities first. But building good theories of these capacities is difficult. That is because the phenomena are quite complex to explain. And at the same time, much too little resources go into building theories about these capacities. Instead, most resources still go into testing effects. But if we are already overwhelmed with things to explain, and so little to explain them with, why do psychologists keep hunting for more and more effects? And why neglect theory building? Well, I think that there are several obstacles, and I will discuss two obstacles in the way. The first obstacle is the persistent idea that theory is to be built on effects. So there's a persistent belief that first we need to collect many effects, and then on that or from that, we can build theory. Now, to illustrate why I think this is a mistaken idea, let me use an analogy. I think that trying to build theory from effects is like trying to write a novel from randomly generated sentences. Now, of course, if you write a novel, there will be sentences that you need to write the novel. But if you randomly generate sentences, many of the sentences that you generate are actually not useful, not relevant for your novel. And also, many that you actually would need to tell your story, you may probably not happen to generate randomly. If you want to write a novel, you need to have an idea about what you're writing about. Now, even if this argument convinces psychologists that, okay, maybe theory needs not built on effects, there is another obstacle. And that is that psychology, or much of psychology, lacks actually a systematic approach to theory building. So if theory is not built on effects, then where to start? And here I think that psychology can really benefit and learn from cognitive science. So what is cognitive science? Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary field of studying cognition. So that is mind and behavior. How does that work? And this is studied by all kinds of different disciplines, such as neuroscience, linguistics, computer science, philosophy, anthropology, and also cognitive psychology is one of the cognitive sciences. Now, in particularly, concepts from computer science and philosophy have proven instrumental for actually building theories of cognitive capacities in cognitive psychology. And what I propose is that these concepts for theory building can also be usefully exploited for building theories in other parts of psychology. So what kinds of concepts do I mean? Okay, so one example concept is the notion of levels of explanation. And this idea is that we can build explanations of capacities by actually answering questions at least 3 different levels. At the top level, we can ask, what is the capacity? What is the nature of the capacity? At the second level, we can ask, how is the capacity realized? By what processes? And at the third level, we can ask, how are those processes physically instantiated? To illustrate this idea, let's look at a simple capacity, the capacity for sorting. So for instance, you can sort people by age, or maybe you can sort movies by how much you like them. And you can also sort letters in the alphabet. So here at the top, you see a very simple capacity theory that says, okay, the capacity for sorting, it takes in, or as a starting state, a set of unordered letters, and it gives back a string of ordered letters. Okay, at the second level, there can be different ways, different processes or procedures, we also call them algorithms, to actually compute that ordering capacity. I show here 2 examples. The one on the left, selection sort. It's a procedure that just goes through the list and picks the next letter that is earliest in the alphabet and puts it in the open slot until the full list is sorted. On the right, you see bubble sort, which is a different procedure, and it just considers 2 consecutive letters. And if the one that is on the right comes earlier in the alphabet than the one on the left, the 2 are swapped. And these swappings continue until the full string is sorted. There are many other algorithms. These are just 2. Now also each such algorithm can be physically instantiated in different ways. For instance, you could program a computer to do sorting according to one of these algorithms. But as you have been following along with me, also maybe your brain was doing the sorting along with me. And you can also implement such sorting algorithms in, say, Hungarian dancers. And maybe you think, Hungarian dancers? Yes, indeed, you can implement sorting algorithms on Hungarian dancers. And if you want to see how, you can actually look on YouTube and search it. Don't look now, after this session, and you can find Hungarian dancers implementing various sorting algorithms. Okay, so this is to illustrate how we can come up with precise explanations at different levels of analysis. But you already see that there's many options even for a very simple capacity. Now, to do a similar analysis for cognitive capacities like communication or vision, this is quite challenging because there are in principle infinitely many functions that you can choose from at the top level. And for every possible function, you may hypothesize. You could hypothesize different algorithms that actually compute that function. And again, for every algorithm, there can be different physical instantiations. So even though this framework gives an idea on how to approach theory building, it's still quite challenging because how do we come up with these explanations at these different levels? Well, basically we do that by thinking, because that's really what developing theory is. And it's hard, but that doesn't mean we need to do unaided thinking. Because like we use in science also tools to see or perceive better, further and smaller, so too we have tools for thinking. Tools that we can use to actually think further and think better. And I list here some examples of such thinking tools. Very obvious one, maybe the first tool for theoreticians is just pen and paper or a whiteboard. Being able to put your thoughts on paper, being able to look at them, manipulate them and see how they relate to each other. Also, philosophical analysis provides tools for systematic thinking about what are concepts, what kind of concepts do we actually need? in our theories? Are they consistent with each other? We can also build on fundamental theorems from computer science and use mathematical proofs to try and prove properties that must hold about cognitive capacities according to our theories. Now, it can also be that sometimes it's too difficult to really analytically derive, so we can use computer simulations, and by that actually do sort of automated thought experiments and have the computer run through all kinds of different theoretical options. But before we can do that, we need to develop models and formalisms that actually can be implemented in such computer simulations. Now, these tools for thinking, they have been around for some time. And in fact, cognitive science has already been using them to develop theories, at least since the 1950s. Now, what I want to do with my DLF project is actually make these tools more widely accessible, also for psychologists outside of cognitive science. To this end, I am writing an open and interactive textbook together with Mark Blockpool to make these tools accessible. But at the same time, in order to stimulate that people actually adopt these tools, it also has to be made clear why it is useful to do so. And for this, I think what is needed, what Josue and I have coined, an epistemological sea change. That is really a qualitative conceptual shift in how we think about scientific progress in psychology. And also a little bit further in the future, I will be organizing a Lorentz workshop on the topic, what makes a good theory? And this workshop will bring together researchers from various different disciplines, computer science, biology, psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, to actually think about this question and share their respective perspectives. Okay, so with this, I have come to the end of my talk, and I would like to thank again NIAS and the Lorentz Center, but also my institutional support, and of course, my wonderful collaborators. I'm also very curious to hear what the discussants have to say, and I give the floor back to Jan Willem.
Iris, thanks so much for this brilliant expose. I try to organize some applause, but that's difficult in these days, as we know. So let's move on to the first discussant. Kenneth J Gurjan is a senior research professor of psychology at Swarthmore College and the president of the Tiles Institute, both in the US. He has served as an editor of the American Psychologist and is also the co-founder of the journals Theory and Psychology and Qualitative Psychology. Gurjan has received honorary degrees from Tilburg University and the University of Athens and is an honorary professor at the University of Buenos Aires. He is listed among the 50 most influential living psychologists in the world. And I want to mention that as well. He has been a fellow at NIAS in 1988-89. Kenneth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan Willem. That was my tenure at NIAS was one of the most pleasant years of my life, and I appreciate the offerings that you have there. It's really a wonderful institute. And I think this talk today is indeed an example of that. Iris, it was a very special talk, very thoughtful, provocative, and engaging, and I really appreciate that. Now, commentary. Well, first of all, let me say just a word about what we're calling the crisis in replicability. Because in a sense, I think the entire attempt to replicate was probably misconceived in the first place. I mean, if you look at most of what we do as human beings, most of it is pretty much historically and culturally situated. Given that culture and history changes very rapidly, why should we suspect that indeed we would be the same persons over time and space, laboratories, countries, and so on? And just to pose the problem more succinctly, I'd like to think of the 1,000 euro test. That is there anything that we produce as an effect, for example, that if you paid a person 1,000 euros, could they learn not to do that? If we paid a person 1,000 euros not to bleed when their artery was cut, chances are they could never do that. But I think indeed for most of what we study, people could either do it in a moment or they could learn to do it, perhaps even reversing, for example, the Stroop effect. So that's the first case. Now, I also agree with you, Iris, that the problem, chasing after effects is probably not very useful. I once thought here, what would life be like given this kind of accumulation? Would it be like one effect after another? Like here I have a Stroop effect, and there's a Zeigarnik effect, and there's a dissonance reduction effect, and so on and so on. And I just am my life is sort of one damn effect after another. So clearly, there are great limits in studying these effects. Now, is theory the answer? Well, having lived through about 60 years of psychology, I have to realize that back when I was a graduate student, indeed, theory was the answer. And indeed, as Sigmund Koch has explicated, it was the age of theory. Learning theory was in its primacy. Clark Hull's theory, highly sophisticated. Skinnerian theory, less sophisticated, but carrying a lot of empirical data with it that were provocative and could be replicated largely with animals. That came to an end because it sort of led nowhere. One couldn't do very much with it. One couldn't deduce anything from Hullian theory. One couldn't apply very much in the way of Skinnerian theory to human beings. And indeed, why we're at the point we are now with effects is largely because of a kind of a repudiation of the grand age of theory, and let's get back to building from observation and induction, which we now know is a great problem. So how do we think of theory? And indeed, I look forward to the outcomes of your workshop. I approach this from a social constructionist perspective, which is to say, look, theory, wonderful, let's do that, but let's ask two questions. What can we do with it? That is, what do we do with a theory outside of talk with each other and publish more papers? Where does it have a cutting edge within the culture? What does it contribute to the world? And secondly, a kind of reflective vision. One which asks, and this is maybe Louise's question, what are the values that it contains? So my approach is kind of a reflective pragmatism. And if I look back on sort of grand theories which have had a marked effect on human life, or at least cultural life in the West, if you take Darwinian theory, take Freudian theory, take Marxist theory, none of them predict anything. They're ways of accounting for things in a particular way. They can't be proven or disproven, but they have enormous effects on society for good or ill. And that becomes a real question. Does that contribution take us anywhere in the world? And that really depends on a whole question of politics and values and so on, which I think should become part of that discussion that you're going to have. Now, finally, with respect to the theory approach that you're taking, my own sense is that, yes, you can bring people together with all sorts of heuristics about what could be producing this, how would you account for it? As you could see, even with your simple case, you could have multiple heuristics or algorithms which you account for, but then what? Then what? So there is that question. You can complexify the potentials for explanation enormously, but what do you do with it then? Now, my own leaning here is towards what I call kind of a future-forming research, and that is take a practical problem in the world. Take one problem, take the problem of obesity, take the problem of terrorism, take the problem of school dropouts, kids learning who have learning disabilities and so on, and then bring your transdisciplinary team into it and work on the problem, not with the sort of hypotheticals, but trying to work, well, try this and try that, and what would that mean, and how would we think about that, and so on. So I'd love to see the proof in the pudding in this case, but I would really like to start with practical problems in the world instead of laboratory studies in order to reach that point. So there are my 2 cents. Thank you so much. I appreciate your allowing me to be here.
Thanks so much, Kenneth. I can imagine that Iris already wants to answer, but she has to wait for a moment because we have a second discussant, Sarah Georgeston. Sarah is Professor of Developmental Disorders of the Brain at the UMC Utrecht. She was also a NIAS Fellow in 2016-17. And at NIAS, she studied the role of consciousness in psychiatry research and argued we need to rethink the way we study consciousness and human experience. The reality is more constructionist than many scientists think. Georgeston is the author of the book entitled The Universe, Life and Everything, Dialogues on Our Changing Understanding of Reality. And she's also a member of the Jonge Academie of the Royal Academy. Sarah, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jan Willem. And thank you, Iris, too, for an inspirational talk. I very much enjoyed it. You explained it really well, and I was entirely convinced of the importance of theory in psychology until, of course, Ken came on and made me doubt all that again. So thanks to you too, Ken. I want to talk a little bit, start by talking a little bit about my own field, which is the neurobiology of psychiatry, essentially, and to note that the replication crisis, as we've called it in psychology, actually extends beyond psychology to adjacent fields like psychiatry. I've worked a lot on ADHD, and what we do is we look for brain changes in ADHD that are associated with symptoms, changes in brain structure, in connectivity, in brain function, all of that. And the same applies. We have poor replication across sites, across studies, and we're thinking we're looking at a harder biological signature than we might do in psychology. But we're also facing an explanatory gap. The variants that we can explain in the phenotypes in terms of the symptoms by the changes we do find in the brain when we can get them to replicate is only in the order of a few %. And even when we run huge mega-analyses to finally pinpoint these brain changes, it's really not clear how these changes cause such things, such as ADHD symptoms in psychiatry, much less the experience of the person who's actually having these symptoms. So I think one reason for that might be that one reason for our focus on methods and the effort that we put into things like doing these mega-analyses maybe that it's relatively safe. It keeps us thinking about these things, and it means that we don't actually have to address any of the theories that are implicit in what we're doing all the time, because although we don't talk about theories very much, of course, there are sort of implicit assumptions underlying what we do. So one point I wanted to make is that I think there is an underlying theoretical framework that we have and that we turn to work by in psychiatry and in psychology a lot of the time too, and that is materialism. The idea that there is something that the brain does, it has brain function, and somehow out of that brain function comes everything that we experience. You know, the experience of being a human being, including humans who have ADHD symptoms or any other type of other symptoms, but also the societies we build, the way we organize our society. And as Ken was saying, I do believe, and as Jan Willem just said, I do believe that we're underestimating the role we have in the society we create. And I think one of the examples you showed actually in the cognitive psychology slide with the effects of the optical illusion shows that rather nicely. There is no triangle, but the way we construct our reality, we certainly see a triangle there just by virtue of the other shapes around it. Of course, in the case of psychiatry, that becomes more problematic because experience and behavior that we then term, as you know, mental disorders, were sort of imposing implicit norms on the sort of behavior we expect to be normal, what we ask people to do. In ADHD, there's a great example of what we call the relative age effect, which is that the youngest kids in the classroom tend to get diagnosed with ADHD more often than their older classmates. And this is an effect that has been replicated, interestingly, across cultures, across the world, independent of what time of year the school year starts. So it really is to do with these kids being relatively young compared to their peers, and for that getting an ADHD diagnosis. So what I wanted to say is that, of course, we're working from this implicit theoretical or philosophical framework of materialism, but it's of course not the only one that's possible. And there are other frameworks that counteract that. And the one I wanted to mention is the absolute antonym to it, which is idealism. The idea that in fact it may be the opposite of material. It may be the case that all of reality is mental and comes forth out of consciousness. And in the case of brain function, of course, it's easy to imagine how mental activity might lead to brain function. It's much more complicated when we start thinking about the material world around us, but the idea from idealism would be that consciousness is overarching, our individual consciousnesses are perhaps part of that, and out of that we somehow jointly create a physical world. And it's a very alien idea to us because we're so used to thinking about science and brain science and psychology from a materialist perspective. But the point I want to make here really is not to argue for idealism. I just want to point out that the crisis we're facing, both in psychology and psychiatry, may be in fact due to the fact that the implicit framework we're working from could be wrong. And that's something I think we might want to think about. So the question that I would want to pose to you, Iris, at the end of that interesting talk, is do you think it would help us if we started making these frameworks more explicit, perhaps work them out more in the way that you're talking about working out theories, and then see how the theories we might want to construct fit within them so that we can actually start pitting these frameworks against each other? Do you think that might be something that helps us to develop better understanding in psychology and psychiatry? So I'm going to give the floor back to Jan Willem now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I propose that we give the floor to Iris to answer to both Kenneth and Sarah, but before I do so, please raise your questions. So now addressing all of you who are listening and watching us, there are already a couple of questions coming in. And as I mentioned at the start, you can do this via YouTube, Zoom, but also Twitter, hashtag NIAS-KNAW. I see already quite some questions. I will try to group them. But first, Iris, the floor is yours. Well, use at least 7 minutes to respond to your both discussions.
Thank you, Jan Willem, and thank you, Sarah and Kenneth, for your very thoughtful comments, also very stimulating. I must say that your comments are very different and therefore also very refreshing, very different from the kinds of comments I'm used to in the kinds of discussions and debates I engage in on a daily basis. So you raised many important issues, and I need to think about which one to highlight and in what order. So let me first mention that Kenneth mentioned, and we agree on it, and I think Sarah and I too, that just studying effects, it's not really going to get us very far in psychology, and it's certainly not a good foundation. And I also wanted to mention, since Kenneth also mentioned some really relevant work also from learning theory and the history of that. I want to mention that already in 1973, also Alan Newell, he published this actually sort of a conference proceedings paper titled, "You Cannot Play 20 Questions with Nature and Win," in which he also argued that if you just play sort of this 20 questions, is this yes-no game where you ask questions, maybe people know it, try to figure out something. And he argued you cannot do science in this way. You cannot say, well, does this effect exist, yes or no? And just from that accumulate scientific knowledge. His proposal was actually to build comprehensive cognitive architectures. So in that sense, we share this view and maybe a common critique of psychological experimental practice. But you also challenge me with some questions, because you say, okay, you propose that theory may be very important and fundamental in solving these issues, but what are you really making theory for? What is the use of the theories that you would like to stimulate psychologists to develop? And well, if I'm honest, I don't think about this question enough. So I think it's very good that you raise it. Why don't I think about this question enough? Because I tend to focus really on fundamental research, and I want to understand how the mind works. I want to figure out how capacities can be realized. But I don't think a lot about the applications. But I agree with you that this is also important, especially also given the point that Sarah makes, and I think you as well, that the kinds of theories we make, they also shape how we think about ourselves. And this has, of course, been a very common critique also of computational metaphor of mind, that maybe we develop a reductive mechanistic view of ourselves. And also Sarah mentions this in her comments, how this can have effects also in psychiatry and neuroscience research. Now there I want to propose that actually I think if we really don't make theories based on a computer metaphor, like using the kinds of computers like my laptop or your desktop computer as an example, as a metaphor for mind, but rather actually go to the really mathematical foundations of computing, then I think a different image appears. Namely, I think there we will see that if you actually try to come up with mathematical theories of these capacities, we will discover that they are much more complex than we imagine them if we study them in just lab tasks. And also that a different possibility in between what's Sarah called materialism and idealism appears, namely implementationalism. So I already gave this example of the different levels of explanation. And if you really reason that through, you see that there is no real one-to-one mapping between mental states and physical states. There's actually a many-to-many mapping. So I think that if you actually work out the formal theory, that we actually come to have a more appreciation for the complexity of our own cognition. Let me see, I don't know if I have time for more comments. I also
yes,
see that
please go ahead for 2 more minutes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so on the one hand, I think really working through these theories, we can appreciate actually the complexity of our cognition, but also at the same time, the bounds of our cognition. Because I saw the question already, anticipating it because it came up in the chat. If we can actually mathematically analyze, if we have theories, that certain kinds of behaviors are beyond our capacities. So if we work out these theories, we can both understand better the scope and the creativity that we have, but also some limitations on these. Now, values. That was also a very important point. And then I get to Sarah's point about explicitness. So Kenneth asks, what are the values that are embedded in these theories? And this is a very important question. Again, one I should think more about. Because sort of a first intuitive idea may be, well, these theories are valueless. I mean, it's just math. But we also know that that is not really true, because how I think of math is just as a very precise formal language. But we can still embed in this language certain values we have. And I agree that it's very important to reflect on this. And it is certainly something that I plan to do more explicitly in the future. And this also relates to Sarah's question to me, who asked, do I think that making our frameworks and our assumptions explicit, that actually helps us to guard against unreflective use of these frameworks? And I think it does. And this is also why I'm very much for very explicit formal theory building, because I think the formalism forces us to be very explicit about what the assumptions are. And this makes it actually possible also to critique these assumptions. So I see formal theory not so much as getting us to truth and other discussion more quickly, but rather understanding better our own thoughts about how we think that things work. And I think that is the purpose of formal theory, to make that explicit so that we can reflect on it and maybe judge that we want to have other thoughts. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Iris. Actually, I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the questions, so that's nice. We do have time for discussion. Let's start the discussion, and let's not stop at 5 o'clock, but let's take at least 15 more minutes after 5 o'clock so that we can deal with some of the questions. I promise all of you who raised questions that all questions will be saved and will be sent to Iris. I cannot promise that she will answer all questions individually, but it is very rich. And I will try to highlight a couple of questions I think that are raised several times. And let me start by a question raised by Jim Jasper. And wait, because I have to do this in a good way. Sorry, what I'm doing now. Let me see what I can do. Can you now see the question raised by Jim Jasper or not? I'm not successful. Well, I will.
You're asking me?
I was asking whether you see the question. I will raise the question that was raised by several people. So the question is the following, Iris. How specific is the crisis that you describe for psychology? And that, of course, is a very broad question, but it is important, right? And already Sarah was hinting that it was also part of psychiatry, but if you look at social sciences, if you look perhaps also at the humanities, many people are wondering, is your criticism actually not pertinent for many more sciences? Or is there something specific about psychology or psychiatry that it is obsessed by effects and also obsessed by the idea of replicability? And Jim Jasper is arguing that perhaps for sociologists, replicability is not so much of an issue or less, and he would love to have it like that and not to make it into a big thing. So not to aim for replicability necessarily. And he gives the example of emotions as far too complex phenomena that you can aim for replicability as such. But many more people ask that question, and they wonder also why, what is it about psychology that they have this aversion towards theorizing? Is it because, as also mentioned already by the discussants, that there has been a certain type of theorizing dominant in psychology in the past, rather, let's say, rather ambitious theorizing or rather general theorizing, like Freudian, what do you say? Theorizing or Marxist theorizing. Well, that's not limited to psychology. So it has to do with the role of theorizing in the past of psychology. So something about the specificity of your endeavor.
So thank you very much. Okay, indeed very rich, even in this one question. So to start, at the start, you asked, or people ask, how specific is the replication crisis to psychology or my consideration? So the replication crisis is certainly not specific to psychology, but I'm a psychologist and a cognitive scientist. And I observe that in how we address within psychology the replication crisis, what I observe is that there are actually some overstatements in how possible solutions in psychology would apply elsewhere. And I actually do not want to repeat such mistakes. That doesn't mean that what I propose is only limited to psychology, and I would happily have conversations with other disciplines about this. But I am not always confident that how I propose what the root problems are in psychology are necessarily the same in other disciplines. Some may overlap. Of course, there's the common argument that it's about incentive structures, that we have a culture where only positive results can be published, and given that there's publish and perish, we actually inflate our literature. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that this holds more widely and not just in psychology. But for instance, the kind of explanations that I propose in terms of explaining capacities, I'm not sure to what extent that applies elsewhere, but I'm very open to exploring this. Another question was about the kinds of theorizing. So what is it about psychology that actually, well, theory is weak, at least according to my criteria of the theory. And I think this has to do with the history of psychology. I already pointed a bit to it in my opening story. I think psychology, when it sort of, well, split off from philosophy, defined itself as a science because of the experimental method. Also historically, sort of the start of experimental or psychology as a science is marked by the starting or the opening of experimental labs by Wilhelm Wundt and William James. And I think it's very much the image, the self-image of psychology, that psychology is a science because we have experiments. If you look at the curriculum in psychology, also my own that I have enjoyed during my training, we're trained meticulously in experimental design. We're also trained in statistics, but I should say mostly cookbook statistics, so that we can run experiments and make inferences fast. But there is no comparable training in developing systematic and cumulative theory. So I think if this is both part of the self-image of a field and all the training goes into doing experiments, and there's of course a publishing tradition of, well, what you publish are experiments, yeah, then you get this situation.
Thanks so much, Iris. I would love to welcome back Sarah and Kenneth as well. And if you want to respond to either the questions I raise or to the responses of Iris, feel very much welcome to do so. Perhaps I can introduce one other set of questions. There are many people that wonder actually what you expect, and now I summarize it in my very clumsy words, what you expect from the role of AI and computers in improving theories, also because you're emphasizing so much formal theories. And there is one anonymous attendee, but I'm raising his or her question, and he says that doesn't the aversion of psychology to theory come from the difficulty to turn vague verbal labels into numbers? And that you actually then are pressing people to frame things more in terms of numbers instead of vague verbal labels. Otherwise, you will never arrive at the type of theory that you seem to embrace. And there perhaps is also still a discussion with Sarah, that Sarah was emphasizing that actually there is theory, but that perhaps you don't see so much, Iris, you don't acknowledge the theory that is implicitly there, materialism in particular, because it is not your type of theory. So then the discussion is not, is there theory, but is the problem that the theory that is mostly implicit present in psychology is not the theory that you want to see there. And many more people ask you then what you expect from computational science. And some people actually are also rather critical that you expect too much from it. And that a lot of the phenomena that has to be explained or better understood by psychology actually will never be explained in numbers or by using more formal models. Can you answer to that cluster? And perhaps, and also if Sarah wants to join, and Kenneth, of course, they're very welcome to do so.
Yeah, so I go first?
Yeah, you go first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so again, many questions. I try to be brief to also give opportunity for Sarah and Kenneth to share your thoughts. So first, what do I expect of the role of AI? I expect that actually the AI, in terms of automating computational models, may both help and hinder good theory building. I recently wrote a blog on this, that I think, of course, the more sophisticated our AI becomes, the more easy we can actually offload our thinking to it. And I think actually to get better theories, we need to do more thinking and not less. So we need to keep in mind, and this is also why I pitch my proposal as tools for theory and not recipes for theory. So we need to be in charge of the tools and we need to wield them skillfully and wisely, and not use the tools to run with our ideas and then just take the output as if that is the truth. So we need to do the thinking. So I see a risk there. So both benefits of using AI and a risk. In terms of math and numbers, and do I not expect too much? Maybe I do expect too much, but I think that a common misunderstanding is that mathematics is about numbers. And it's also a misunderstanding that formal models are quantitative models. I actually am not that interested in quantitative models. I'm mostly interested in formal qualitative models that actually can explain qualitative properties. For instance, why do we see a triangle in the Knizia triangle? That's not a quantitative question, but our perception has certain qualitative properties and we want to explain them. And there is a whole host of mathematics that actually is suited for addressing such qualitative questions, but we don't train students in it. And I think this even starts before university training. The whole notion of what mathematics is very limited. And of course, all the math that psychologists get exposed to in curriculum is basically statistics and not really mathematical modeling. So I think actually, as I said before, mathematics for me is a language to make explicit, and so that we can more explicitly look at the ideas that we're putting out there. So then to come to the question, but don't we already have theories like this philosophical framework of materialism that Sarah mentioned? I would say those for me are indeed a philosophical framework or philosophical presuppositions about the relationship between mind and body. And you are very right, these exist, but I would count these as part of philosophy. And to the extent that they do influence psychologists, great. But I observe that in experimental psychology, there is much too little discussion about whether or not the commitment is materialist or idealist or implementationalist. So I would say yes and no. So yes, there are psychologists, and I'm sure that Sarah and Kenneth are representative of it. I guess this illustrates how big psychology is, right? But if you look at experimental psychology, mostly based on lab experiments, I think there's much too little reflection on these kinds of philosophical questions. And I think it would be very good if that's done more. I don't know if Sarah and Kenneth would like to add.
Yes, please, feel free to join the conversation. Kenneth?
Yeah.
Or Sarah?
Again, is that the theories are ways of communicating. They're sort of language games, if you will. But that's not so interesting. I would argue that most of the sciences, let's say the hard sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, are important primarily because of what they do, what they have allowed us to do as human beings. They've solved practical problems or brought up ways of doing things that we didn't before. So the question would be to start with something that we really care about in the world and start there. And then what theories would be useful for that? Do we need some phenomenology? We need some scenario. Do we need neuroscience? Do we need computational formulation? Do we need cultural anthropology? Do we need sociology? Try to solve that problem. Just take Sarah's problem of ADHD. It's not going to be replicable. We only created it within the last 20 years. So, but it's a major issue. 1 in 10 kids in the United States now are diagnosed with ADHD. Is it a neuro problem? Is it a cultural problem? Is it a problem of the way in which scoring has become the end of education, and so everyone is in the conflict? Is it the result of immersion in the technology world in which classes are boring? I mean, there are enormous numbers of issues there. And they are also philosophic issues, and they are issues of value. That is, why do we treat the child as the problem? Why not look at the whole way in which classrooms are structured that are indeed the creation of the problem, or the parents putting the pressure on the child is the problem? So all of this, but to have a transdisciplinary team to work on one single issue where you could show the fruits of that, enormous potential.
Thanks. Sarah, you want to respond on this, or you? Otherwise, I want to smuggle in another question by the audience. But if you have the same point, please go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'll just be very brief then. No, I agree entirely. I think values, we need to get in there. I mean, that's very important. And to Iris, I would just like to say, yes, I agree, the philosophical frameworks, but they are influencing the way we're thinking about the theories we develop. And, then how we're going to formalize those theories depends entirely on the philosophical framework we're in. So I'd like to get them in there too, but I'll leave it at that and let you move on to the next.
No. It's just that many people have the same kind of questions actually Kenneth was raising, and you also hinted at it in your first contribution, that quite some people actually do agree that it would be good to have those kind of theories. So they are not like, Iris, what are you doing? But they are saying more like, but what then is the eventual goal? Is it because then you can better replicate, or that you can better understand the world, that you can better explain the world, or, coming to Kenneth, that you have better interventions? So that it is really about that we can improve the world, or that we can have people who are less obese, or is that the goal? And people are a little bit confused, and perhaps you have several goals, and perhaps theory is an answer to many things, but it would be good for the audience and also for the discussants that you tell us more about the aim of theorizing.
Yeah, thanks. Very clear. Yeah, so the aim for theorizing, for me personally, is indeed understanding, advancing our understanding and explanation, and mostly actually advancing our understanding of how little we understand. And this is related to Kenneth's point, because Kenneth says, I think rightly, why not put all this interdisciplinary work and a team together to work on a concrete problem that matters and that is of value? And you are totally right. It's not my approach. And some time ago, I learned about this distinction between problem solvers and problem creators. And I'm much more a problem creator than a problem solver. And but I think there is use to this. So the kind of research I do is more to actually poke holes in the kinds of theories we have, hoping we get better theories from this, or better understanding, or maybe even have a better understanding of the limitations of our understanding. Now, I do think that has value, because I think some of maybe the concerns or damage that both of you raised, like in psychiatric practice or in education, may be seen as due to a too simplistic idea about how mind and behavior work. And not seeing that actually, for instance, behavior, to come back to the question of reductionism, is itself emergent from a very complex interaction between brain, body, and environment. And if we do not have the scientific tools to actually systematically think about such complex processes, I think there is sort of, an attractor back to simpler stories. And I want to complicate the stories. Maybe in that sense, I'm a little bit like in the humanities, right? Where there's also a tradition of problematize. And so maybe I'm a humanities problematizer in the formal theory framework, where I think, no, we're not done yet. And I think there is value in that, even if it doesn't solve directly a practical problem. Maybe the value is to keep everybody on their toes and say, no, you haven't understood it yet, and things may be more complicated than they may now seem. I don't know if I addressed everything. Did I forget an important point you raised, Kenneth?
No, but I would question the aim of understanding, because we have multiple perspectives from which we can understand things. Computational perspective is just a sort of a new kid on the block. To claim understanding is only to claim the perspective. So what would be the advantage of one perspective over another?
Well, I think it's good to have multiple perspectives.
Agreed.
So I certainly don't want to argue this is the only fruitful perspective. This is absolutely not. And this also, when I said we can learn from cognitive science, here's one perspective that we can use, and it will have its scope, and it will also have its limitations. So I certainly don't want to argue this is the end all of theory building in psychology. I actually think we need different perspectives, and the complexity of the subject matter, this is actually work in progress, where I now want to actually using mathematics to prove that if you take only one perspective on the complex subject matter, actually you cannot understand the complex subject matter. So this is maybe quite meta, but this is to use at the meta science level, actually this complexity results to say something about the cognition of scientists, because ultimately scientists are also just meaning makers.
And perhaps then the final question, and I'm just echoing what I'm reading in the questions, and I think that we covered most questions that were raised by the audience. But it is a Kenneth question again, that, okay, multiple perspectives, multiple theories, making things more complex, then we better understand things, but we also can make the world a better place. Does it have a practical aspect in it itself?
I have a firm belief that...
Interventionist?
Yeah, but not directly. So it's my personal... not my personal interest to intervene in that sense, like not to use our theories to then say, okay, this is how we should, like policy for education or whatever. I guess my perspective is fundamental belief that if we improve our understanding, and especially also the nuances of our understanding, that this is valuable in itself. So this is indeed a presupposition that I'll make explicit.
Right. I think those are beautiful closing words, actually. And well, let's think about that. I do remember then when we started this academic year, and Iris was one of the new fellows, that she's always twittering what we are doing, and that she wrote very honestly and very stimulating, I have to say, that indeed having those multiple perspectives at NIAS, many people coming from the humanities and social science, was not easy, right? So it's not an easy embrace of multi-perspectivity or something like that, and not we make the world more complex because we want to do that, but because the world is complex and we need all those perspectives to better understand it. And in that sense, she really has become a NIAS fellow, I have to say. So I'm very happy that you bring in that perspective in this discussion. I'm very sorry to those in the audience that perhaps I didn't literally raise your question, but I hope I did it in the spirit. I think we covered most of the questions, as I said, but we will save the questions as we recorded the full session. And Iris will get all the questions that came to us via YouTube, via the Zoom, and also via Twitter. I love to thank, of course, first of all, Iris, but very much as well, Kenneth and Sarah for their comments for this discussion. I like to thank, of course, the Lorentz Center for the cooperation and the very fact that we have this institute of the Distinguished Lorentz Fellow. I almost want to close this event, but I just want to mention that the next NIAS talk will take place on December 10th. And the title is The Unmaking of Medical Inadmissibility. And it is about the role of medicine in the admission of foreigners coming to Canada. And we all think about Canada as the paradise for people and that they all can come in. But also Canada seems to be highly exclusionary, particularly based on all kinds of medical conditions. Well, that's just to summarize. I do it in a clumsy way, but it is a very interesting event on December 10th, starting at 8 o'clock here online. And if you follow the program by Spuit25, you will see it listed there. All right, thanks to all of you. Have a good night. I don't know what time it is, Kenneth, there at your place.
Morning, late morning.
You have still a long day to go. All right. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.